Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groos, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Kohei Saito in today's episode. Kohei is professor at the University of Tokyo. He writes with spectacular success about Degrowth Communism, and very recently a German translation of his book has been released by DTV under the title Systemsturz, der Sieg der Natur über den Kapitalismus. I was very lucky to catch Saito at the Viennese Volksstimmenfest, and he was very spontaneously willing to record an episode of Future Histories the next day. Before we start, I would like to welcome Daniel, Jakob and Christoph as patrons of Future Histories, and I would like to thank Lukas and Wilfried for their kind donations. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Kohei Saito on Degrowth Communism. Welcome, Kohei.
Thank you for invitation.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. Kohei, you have coined the label Degrowth Communism, and it seems to be a very effective and kind of provocative tool. Maybe for those who don't know about it, what is Degrowth Communism?
Okay, so what I try to do in my book is basically, if you want to really be serious about climate crisis, you have to be anti-capitalist. Capitalism, I don't think, can solve climate crisis by simply investing in renewable energies and electric vehicles, because capitalism is a system of constant expansion, constant valorization, which is always accompanied by the increase of energy and the resource usage. So the new technology try to, decouple the economic growth from usage of energy and resources, but it hasn't been sufficient, and it won't be, because this system of constant accumulation will always demand excessive production and consumption in order to keep this system going. So I advocate degrowth communism, and this has two aims. One is basically communism, or any socialists need to learn from degrowth side. Its tradition, especially I come from the Marxist background, it's characterized by a kind of productivism. More technologies will be good. It will bring many things to working class, and also it will prepare the foundation for a new society, and so on and so on. But I argue that this optimism is not valid anymore, especially in the face of ecological crisis. So I think communist or socialist side have to accept this idea of degrowing, which actually means not about going back to, pre-modern, go back to nature kind of things. Rather, it first asks to abandon GDP as a measure of progress, but at the same time, it also demands to reduce what is unnecessary. There are many excessive things, as I said. So why don't we reduce them? Because they are not really contributing to our well-being, and it also destroys the planet and so on. And however, degrowth side should also learn from communist side, because some degrowth people are not so explicit about overcoming or criticizing capitalism. But I think degrowth capitalism cannot be possible, because, as I said, capitalism is simply about growth, right? So if we really want to have degrowth, we need to challenge the market system, the price mechanism, and private property, and that kind of things. So in the sense that the degrowth also can learn a lot from the socialist side. So I just try to combine both of them, and degrowth communism, which actually has been quite successful in Japan.
Right, not only in Japan, I have to say. It has been quite successful as a discursive carrier far beyond Japan, I have to say. So maybe let's talk about your engagement with the theory of metabolism, which is very foundational for your perspective, I think. So what does the theory of metabolism entail, and what are the different layers to it? And maybe what role does it play for your thinking about post-capitalism?
So when I talk about degrowth communism, this is actually coming from Karl Marx. So I even argue that Marx became a degrowth socialist, degrowth communist in the end of his life. But in order to reach this point, I think this theory of metabolism is quite important. So this theory and concept of metabolism, Stoffwechsel, comes from Karl Marx. His point is quite simple. He characterizes actually labor, the one of the fundamental category of his critical political economy, as the conscious mediation of human metabolic interaction with nature. So human produces many things with certain aims, and they improve new technologies and so on. But this process is a kind of a circular process, because human takes out of energy resources from nature, and they produce something, and then they consume them, and then there will be a waste of energy and resources. They go back to nature. So this is a kind of circular process that is basically everywhere, anywhere in the time of history. So as long as humans live, this process of metabolism will continue. We cannot ignore this, and this is a natural kind of law of our existence. I mean, any living being, but the humans can consciously mediate this metabolism with nature. But the problem is, under capitalism, this metabolism is disrupted. Marx calls this disruption metabolic rift, and this is basically because capitalism try to expand all the time, and they try to accelerate at the same time, and which creates a tension with this natural metabolism, which exists independently and prior to capitalist accumulation. For example, capitalism always try to extract more resources, and they try to, extract more soil nutrition for the sake of food production, and these kind of the process becomes much bigger and bigger for the sake of economic growth, but at the same time it becomes faster. They try to make many circuits so that they can have bigger profit, and this creates a tension because the process of nature is much actually slower, and it cannot always catch up with the speed of acceleration of capital. So when this tension becomes so high, there will be various contradictions such as soil exhaustion, excessive deforestation leading to the desertification, but also the fossil fuel has been extracted in such a speed that it is now disrupting the Earth system, so leading to the climate crisis and so on. So Marx's theory of metabolism gives us a basic idea of how capitalist production is basically incompatible with this trans-historical law of humans and nature metabolism.
Right, and maybe to underscore this incompatibility, you can also explain the three shifts that you introduce, because you kind of lay out the argument that there are these three rifts that capitalism brings about through its specific form of relating to this metabolism. But then you also argue that there will be no way in which capitalism will be able to fix this, because it constantly instead shifts in order to kind of prevent a complete collapse in the face of this metabolic rift.
Yeah, so what's interesting about Marx's theory of metabolic rift is that he's not like apocalyptic. He's not saying that one day because of the metabolic rift, capitalism will collapse or something like that. Rather, he's using this concept as an analytical tool, which means that he questions then why capitalism actually survives despite this contradiction of metabolic rift. His answer is basically the capital can always shift this contradiction to somewhere else. The one easy solution is a new technology. So basically, when the soil gets exhausted under capitalist agriculture, they will introduce chemical fertilizer, for example. But this chemical fertilizer is often produced by using fossil fuels, which leads to another problem like climate change. So the problem is capital can use those technological shifts in order to solve the soil exhaustion, for example, but it can only shift it to somewhere else by creating a new problem like climate change. And there are also other ways of shifting the rift. The other one he argues is spatial shift. So which means that we have, like, for example, a lot of plastics. Now we try to recycle, but it's just simply too many. So what happens is that under the name of recycling, these plastics will be shipped to, like, for example, China or other Asian countries. So the problem of plastics become invisible in the rich countries like Europe and Japan, but simply because this waste has been carried away from somewhere to another place. And this is a kind of the global north-south inequality. And the problem is that by shifting spatially this metabolic lift, the weaker, the marginalized, the periphery will suffer more. So this has been very problematic already in the 19th century. Marx is arguing about guano, the resources to gain the soil fertility, but the problem is guano comes from the Latin America, so although the resources will be simply extracted from the Latin America, the resources will be carried from the global south to England. So this kind of center-periphery contradiction is already dealt by Marx using this spatial shift. And the third way of shifting the metabolic lift is a temporal one. And that's what we see today in terms of climate change. Now we emit a lot of carbon dioxide today, but we will not immediately suffer from the consequences. Who will suffer? The later generations, the children today. No? So the problem is those who are responsible today will not suffer the consequences. The younger ones who are less responsible will suffer the consequences, what we do right now, because of this temporal shift. So the shifting in these three ways always creates some room for capital to accumulate more wealth now. But the problem become deeper and deeper in the future, also in the periphery and for the weaker, for the poor. So this creates the question. So how do we actually solve this? We really need to have a more just conception of taking the responsibility, and so which means that we need to regulate the activities of big corporations. We also need to tax the riches and then challenge the extreme concentration of the wealth. And we also bring the view of the future generations in order to discuss these kind of issues. And I think when we really bring these kind of aspects together, capitalism will be fundamentally challenged. I think there will be some kind of the post-capitalist imaginary that is required in order to address these issues, and they also need to practically introduced in this way.
Before we dig deeper into this political imaginary and the possible ways in which this relation can be formatted in a very different way, I would like to ask one or two things about this whole complex of metabolism. For example, I was asking myself, you seem to rely on a certain form of essentialism when it comes to what you call primary level of the universal metabolic processes between humans and nature. And from this primary level, one could then derive elementary requirements and, so to speak, natural limits. And I was wondering if this kind of conception might lead to some form of scientism, in which it is kind of neglected that these limits are also part of a process of negotiation and permanent scientific contestation. So how is this border expressed, this kind of quote-unquote natural limit, and taken into account specifically? Because I think there's no way around the idea that what counts as nature is constantly shifting and evolving, and that it is not a stable category in this sense, but must also be kind of renegotiated, so to speak. So.
This is a topic that I don't really discuss in Systemsturz. Rather, I discuss this issue in my another book, The Marx in the Anthropocene, and which is actually a very important topic because the recent academic popular discourse is rather characterized by a kind of monism. As you said, what we conceive as a nature is at least not socially constructed, but at least socially mediated by languages and powers and so on and so on. So we cannot have a kind of the rigid distinction between what is natural and what is social and so on and so on. So even actually the metabolic rift is recently accused of falling into a kind of the dualist thinking. People like Jason Moore actually criticized the concept of metabolic rift as Cartesian dualism of society and nature with capital S and N. But I actually do not think so. I argue in my book that Marx was ontologically monist, but analytically or methodologically dualist. So his theory of metabolism and his theory of materialism is basically about how humans are part of nature, and they are, also a constant part of this flow and the exchanges of resources and energy. So in a sense, ontologically, there is no absolute separation between humans and nature because, humans are part of nature, as I said. So there's some kind of continuity of nature and society, obviously, because society is also embedded in nature. But that doesn't mean that we cannot distinguish social and the natural. Rather, I think it's very important to distinguish the natural and social because there are certain which recently called emergent properties, which means that there are properties that do not exist in nature, that only exist in society or under certain social relations. For example, take the concept of value. If humans do not exist, the value, of course, do not exist. So value is some kind of a social property, social category that only exists under social relation. If you look at other forms of society, it's possible that they don't have the conception of value. Only under capitalism, value becomes such a central concept. And then this value becomes the organizing principles of metabolic interaction between humans and nature. But value doesn't necessarily take care of all the dimensions, all the complexity of this metabolism, because value is, according to Marx, it's just a objectification of abstract labor. So the mediation of metabolic interaction between humans and nature by value is from the beginning very one-sided, and this will create the kind of problems that I discussed as metabolic rift, because value is not concerned about sustainability, especially capitalism is only about increasing this objectification of abstract labor, leading to this kind of contradiction. And what's important is in also addressing this kind of metabolic rift, we also need to distinguish social and natural, because what is social is something that we can also change. We can change law, we can also change how we produce, we can also change what we produce, and because these are the social things. But we cannot change, for example, the natural law. For example, the ice melts at the 0 degrees Celsius, and when with the carbon dioxide, the world temperature will rise, and these are the natural process that we cannot change. But we can change by using fossil fuels. We stop that, and then we will use something else that does not emit the carbon dioxide. So because this choice is actually social, in the face of those natural laws that we cannot change. So even in this very simple example, we already distinguish what is social and what is natural. Otherwise, when we accept everything is sort of mixed, we cannot really decide what we can also change and what we cannot change, and so on. So I argue that this analytical distinction of society and nature is very fundamental for any critical discussion of how we overcome capitalism and how we challenge this issue of climate breakdown and so on.
Very, very interesting. We don't have to get into this, but my intuition would be that there is some kind of third way, that there is a politicized new materialism, so to speak, where this idea of breaking down this dualism of nature and culture does not end up in some kind of relativism, but indeed actually proposes a different kind of politicization, which would be quite close to what you're trying to argue for as well, I think. So maybe just another thing on the metabolism and monism, because this I really didn't understand, basically, because you kind of criticized a relational approach towards this question of metabolism, and you do not only point towards the work of Jason Moore in this regard, but you you also point to works of, let's say, Bruno Latour, and maybe one could add Donna Haraway or people like that. And then you kind of try to couple them to a form of Promethean thinking that is actually found in left accelerationism. But I would argue that these are very, very different types of paradigms. So, I mean, Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway, they would never kind of argue for geoengineering, for example. So this is not really, at least in my interpretation, coming from the same paradigm as a source, I would say. So this would also then lead to the question whether or not there is something to gain from a relational perspective that does not actually go into some kind of left accelerationism, because this is something different.
Like, so when Bruno Latour is criticized for falling into that kind of Promethean tendency, is especially because of his association with the Breakthrough Institute, which is advocating for a very eco-modernist kind of ideas like nuclear fusion and geoengineering and so on. And Latour, of course, doesn't really endorse that kind of decisions, the political choices in his work, but his famous Love Your Monster is about creating more intimacy of us humans and that kind of technologies, instead of simply saying, oh, the technology that we invented is so dangerous, so why don't we just like abandon them, and that kind of things is often characteristic to environmentalists or degrowth people. And Latour kind of criticizes that kind of ideas, and rather argue for embracing the more intimacy of humans and technology and so on. But it's just one short piece of article, and then that doesn't necessarily represent everything about his theory, of course. So I'm not saying that he's a left-wing accelerationist, and they are very different kinds of people, and then Donna Haraway obviously doesn't belong to that kind of a tendency. However, at the same time, there's some danger in monism, in a sense that when we really relativize what is social and what is natural, we can easily say that there is no more nature, so why don't we intervene more? Because the more we intervene, it doesn't matter because it is already social. So this kind of the sliding of the argument from the critical attitude towards a more uncritical endorsement of the status quo, and even advocacy for the further intervention of social technology into the sphere of nature, it's something that I find very dangerous today, especially because of the geoengineering and that kind of possibilities. But at the same time, there's more fundamental problem to it, because I think with the kind of monism, we cannot defend the humanism anymore. And I characterize Marxism, or Marx, as a humanist thinker. So his idea of regulating metabolism and fixing this metabolic lift is about securing a kind of the sustainable condition for human development. So it is about kind of humanist idea of development and well-being and so on and so on. But when we have a kind of monism, human loses the distinctive position in this kind of discourse and the vision of the future. So we can no longer say human values are important. The human value needs to be centered on the kind of discussion for climate crisis and so on. But I think we can never abandon anthropocentric view, even if we talk about other species. It's from our viewpoint, and it's based on our knowledge of other species and so on. So it's in some sense always anthropocentric. And at the same time, when we talk about sustainability or environmental justice, these categories are also quite anthropocentric. Not only what is sustainable is required for the sake of human prosperity. Of course, it includes other species and so on, but as I said, this is also conditioned by our view. So I think it's really important to have some kind of the acceptance of inevitable anthropocentrism. I'm not saying that humans are like exemption. So I'm against human exemptionalism. But I think we have to accept a weaker form of anthropocentrism in a sense. And then from that, we argue for sustainability, justice, and that kind of things. But that already requires certain kind of distinction of human and non-human, so inevitably dualism. And even, what I find a little bit weird is the fact that even like a post-humanist and like a monist people are basically using the human language, and they're talking for the human people. They are not talking to other species, right? I mean, so this theory itself, they try to deny one of the central position of humans in terms of ideas, discourses, and so on. But they are basically working within the humanist category. So I think that for the sake of protecting the nature and protecting the human development and so on, we need a weaker dualism. So that's my argument.
Very, very, very interesting, I have to say, because, I mean, one position would be to say, well, that these forms of relationality actually aim towards different modes of relating to these spheres of reproduction and cycles of reproduction that you also aim to kind of transform, not the cycles themselves, but the relation towards them. And so I would kind of see a compatibility between these two end goals as well, but I totally understand your point about kind of not being able to leave a certain perspective that will always have to entail a human perspective as well, because there's a certain gap within the theory on the relational part when it comes to, for example, like concrete proposals for a post-human demos or something like that, which would then be able to bring about a form of democracy that includes the post-human, the more than human, because I was asking a couple of people on this podcast how one might think about this in very practical terms, and it's like really difficult to come up with an answer. Right? Yeah, but still, I mean, it's I'm still, I would say, kind of undecided if this really means that there is nothing to gain from this strand, so to speak, because I think specifically when it comes to this question of how we will, and this is something you argue for as well, how we will definitely have to change ourselves and our positionality towards the more than human in order to come to a point where this interaction with the metabolism is qualitatively different. So there needs to be a kind of there needs to be some movement on the human part as well. So we cannot stick to a strictly humanist perspective, because we will have to show some flexibility there as well. And this is something you really point towards very vehemently. So I see some conversion of the different positions there, I have to say. So maybe let's try to change this last point into a question. So what would then be a possible route to approach qualitatively different ways of engaging in this question of metabolism? How can we think about this relation in a really qualitatively different way?
Yeah, the simple answer is degrowth. Yeah? So that's why I advocate for degrowth communism, because Marx was always, of course, communist, but he was not so explicit about how the future society looked like when it actually fix or repair this metabolic lift. And he was quite vague about on that point in Capital. So I started looking at his notebooks, especially because he didn't publish much after the volume 1 of Capital. And the later stage of his life, he intensively studied natural sciences and pre-capitalist societies, but he didn't publish his results of research at all. And so when we try to learn something from the late Marx, we have to look at these notebooks. And I'm actually editor of Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, which actually publishes this kind of notebooks that have been ignored even by researchers for many, many years. And then one thing that I presented in my previous book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, is basically that Marx became quite ecological in his research on natural sciences. He was concerned about soil exhaustion, deforestation, extinction of species, and these kind of issues was quite central for his research on natural sciences. But at the same time, he also studied pre-capitalist societies, and he looked at societies like Russia, India, and Latin America, Africa, and also even like ancient societies like Rome, Teutonic communes, and other forms of indigenous people and so on. And then he realizes that by looking at these communes and societies, they are quite equal. It's a primitive communism, so everyone is basically living without hierarchy, and they are quite equal and so on. But at the same time, their communes, their communities were quite sustainable, long-lasting. And he used to despise this kind of the persistency of pre-capitalist communes, especially in his writings in the 1850s. He wrote quite negatively about Indian societies because it doesn't change, it doesn't develop, it doesn't grow. So British colonialism, please come help them destroy all the communities, and so that the British capitalism will be introduced in India, and then it will finally bring a revolution in India as well. And that's very productivist. But he changed his ideas in the 70s and the 80s, rather correcting his earlier view, because these societies have some kind of economic superiority because it is more sustainable than Western capitalist societies. So he accepted, okay, this persistency is actually something positive. They don't seem to develop much, but at the same time, it means that super sustainable in the sense. So he realized that this relationship, their relationship with nature, is something very different from the capitalist relations, metabolic relation with nature. So here comes in again the dualism. So metabolism with humans and nature is transhistorical. So even pre-capitalist non-Western society also organizes this metabolism. They have to, but in a very different way than capitalism does. And this organization is the basis for social equality and sustainability. In a conclusion, Marx actually wrote to Bela Zasulich saying that the Western capitalism, now facing to a very serious crisis today, needs to return to a higher form of archaic type of these communes. This is how the Western societies, Western capitalism can solve its own contradiction, which means after looking at these notebooks on natural sciences and pre-capitalist societies, which means basically that Western societies have to make the metabolic interaction more sustainable and more equal by accepting certain kind of the persistency and certain kind of the steady state economy. So that is why I argue that capitalism creates some tension, it's irreparable, and metabolic rift cannot be repaired, but the socialism can repair this metabolic rift because in the end Marx realizes these Western societies will be also turned into a kind of degrowth society. I think this is only the consistent way of understanding his struggle with his own ideas about metabolic rift and historical materialism.
Very interesting. But then still, I think the question remains, is there a material foundation for this type of degrowth communism? I mean, it's not only relevant when it comes to the question of how for example, nowadays the global south might transition towards degrowth communism, but it's also in general a question, because also like hunter-gatherer societies were only able to be egalitarian when people were able to kind of flee the collective as well, and nobody was able to kind of monopolize the resources. So there were always material conditions as well. So what would then be the material conditions for degrowth communism?
I think it's more like a natural necessity coming from the planetary boundaries. So that's where this social metabolism is conditioned by the law of nature, like planetary boundaries. So we cannot actually have the social system that constantly try to expand and expand, which is capitalism, because capitalism now clashes with these planetary boundaries, creating various kinds of ecological crises. So what we are facing today is this task. We need to consciously organize or consciously or socially regulate this metabolic interaction within planetary boundaries. So this is, we cannot change planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries are there. And it is not neo-Malthusian or anything like that. It's just pure scientific fact. We can also develop some technologies to be more efficient and so on, but only within these planetary boundaries. So I think when we accept this boundary, but there are also many social dimensions, like what we produce, how we produce. Within these boundaries are many social and related to power and hegemony and that kind of things. But in any case, we can change these social dimensions only, and then by remaining within the planetary boundaries, I think we just have to have less consumption and less production of unnecessary things. And it means that if we don't grow more in terms of economic terms, we don't produce more, we have to share more things. And this is why I think that the idea of communism is very important for degrowth, because communism is about equal sharing and mutual aid and that kind of things. And so I think the material condition is there in a rather in a way that we don't really want to, but the planetary boundaries are there. And if we really respect them, then we have to have that kind of the new, very different ways of organizing metabolic interaction with nature. And I think this is, the degrowth is basically the only way. And then it is not yet politically attractive because capitalism creates, our vision of abundance and good life and luxury by producing and consuming more cars and flying more and eating more beef or something like that. But if we need to have that kind of the more sustainable transition, I think we can start by, as I discussed yesterday in the Volksstimmefest as well, we can introduce some reform measures by banning private jets, maybe first, and then also we ban other kinds of the other industries, and then we also reduce advertisements. These are the ways that we sort of socially also change our desires and what we want and our perception of what is luxurious, what is fulfilling, and so on. These will gradually transform our ideas and attitude towards degrowth, and it can have, after a certain point, a very radical movements. They can find a very resonance in the various fields of social and environmental movements. And I'm hoping that my book will lay the foundation for the kind of convergence of these two trends, communist, the socialist trend, and the degrowth trend, because there has been a quite antagonism among these schools. And I'm hoping that this will be the first step to create a more meaningful dialogue and a common fight against the ecological crisis.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's a very good project to pursue. Still, I would have like a follow-up question towards this complex of material preconditions, so to speak, because specifically when it comes to this relation between the global north and the global south, I mean, if degrowth people advocate for degrowth, usually they are very keen, and rightfully so, to also articulate that this means degrowth in the global north. And that they cannot and should not kind of dictate the global south to follow a certain path that some Western intellectuals kind of pre-describe, so to speak. And I mean, this gets also kind of more complicated since types of green capitalism engage in what Lula da Silva has recently called green neocolonialism, so there's this angle as well. And so still, I'm wondering how this can be thought about if you think about degrowth communism for the global south. How much growth, so to speak, or which kind of growth is a possible way to pursue, or which kind of different forms of transition would the global south have to engage in differently than the global north, because these are different pathways, you know. It's the old question basically of how can we get to communism not through capitalism.
Exactly. This is what Marx was talking when he was discussing the issue of the Russian path to socialism. And then many Marxists used to think that Russia must be also modernized and capitalized first so that they can build a socialist revolution later. But then Marx's answer was actually different, that we can actually have way that Russia can avoid a sort of the Western industrialization under capitalism, and they can build their own socialism based on the communes that they still had at the time. So I think this question always still come back today, what Global South should do. And I'm not, of course, saying that the Global South should immediately make the transition to degrowth society and they should just remain poor. They need, obviously, in many areas, they need more education, they need more electricity, they need more clean water, and so on, which means that they need a kind of the economic growth, obviously, because I'm not against satisfying people's need, and for them, for that kind of growth is obviously something good, and we should actually support them. But after a certain point, growth doesn't necessarily improve our social well-being, and it doesn't really bring happiness. So the global north is especially excessive in that sense. And I think even the green capitalism, if they try to keep growing in the future, there will be this kind of, the green neo-colonialism, and then they will extract various resources from the global south, and then that kind of the unequal exchange will be strengthened. So in order to avoid that, I think the only solution is, again, degrowth, and the global north needs to sort of limit their own resource consumption and so on. And this is the only way we avoid the excessive extraction of resources from the global south. And what's interesting is basically that I think one of the responsibility for the global north in making this kind of a transition to degrowth society is that they need to redefine the concept of well-being. They need to redefine the concept of abundance, as I said. And then that will make these new ideas of abundance and the development and affluence more attractive even to the people in the global south. I think this is one way. Of course, in this process, the people in the global north need to learn from people from the global south. Now, the concepts like Buen Vivir is obviously the most famous one, but these concepts can be introduced among the societies in the global north to have a better idea of what we should actually produce and how we work and what we should spend in our free time and so on. But only by we actually, I think so in that sense, we have the very strong responsibility, especially when I write about this, I have the Chinese society in my mind, because when the Chinese society try to be like American society, the things will be so bad. But the Chinese people are actually trying to imitate the Western societies in many sense, but this has been also creating some kind of antagonism and stress and suffering among Chinese people. So I think with the Japanese people, Chinese people can together work on the new conception of good life and so on. And then these are the ways that we can actually learn from each other and then come up with a new idea or new forms of development that will be some kind of a common denominator for making just and sustainable transition to another kind of society.
And you use this term steady state economy. I'm just, I would have to read up on it. I have to say somehow this is for me associated with neoclassical economics, this idea of steady state economy. And also I'm asking myself, I'm sure that's not the way that you intended to be like, but somehow it kind of has this association of freezing in a certain moment of quote-unquote progress and then just staying there. But of course, we as humans, we would want to stay in a dynamic form of change, so to speak. So we will want to continue to invent. We would want to continue to find different modes for producing, different modes for whatever, for relating to each other and stuff like that. So there's this kind of, I don't know, maybe conservative notion to this idea of steady state. Maybe just some comments about it, because I'm sure that's not what you
So I actually prefer the term degrowth to steady state economy, because steady state economy is associated with Herman Daly, and his idea is not very anti-capitalist. I mean, not at all. I mean, he says that we can sort of use the market system and a system of private property once we have some kind of reformation on capitalist mode of production. And it looks like, according to Herman Daly, as if steady state capitalism or something like that could be possible. But I'm really against that kind of idea. So, I mean, just sometimes I use the term, yes, a steady state economy, but not for the sake of defending that Herman Daly type of future society, but simply, to have some kind of idea that we don't necessarily pursue the constant growth anymore, and that is, objectively said, it's a kind of steady state economy. So I don't mean more than that.
Yeah. So it's just in the term, in the sense of not to grow the energy throughput overall.
Exactly.
All right. So what I really like about your project is that it very offensively aims at trying to build up a new political imaginary. I really, really like that. And what you also emphasize within this project of building a different political imaginary is that planning will have to play a huge role in that. So you say that social planning of production will need to be an essential part of formatting this relation towards the metabolic interaction. And since Future Histories has really a couple of interviews engaging with the question of democratic planning, I would very much hear your thoughts about this question of democratic planning and how we can bring it about.
I think that some of the proponents of degrowth don't want to talk about planning because planning is a little bit scary. Planning immediately lead us to think about socialism in sense of the Soviet Union. So it's very centralized, bureaucratic, and even inefficient system of a very authoritarian state regulating the entire social production and so on. But the socialist planning actually needs to be a democratic one. It doesn't have to be centralized. It doesn't have to be authoritarian in any sense. We can have more participation of the people and workers in terms of deciding what we actually want to produce and what is actually shouldn't be produced anymore because they are excessive and so on. And think about this kind of transition for a more decarbonized society. We have to, at some point, need to decide not producing car with the gasoline. So that's also one form of planning. But we cannot leave this decision to companies because they will try to produce the car with gasoline as long as they can. That will be too late. So I think society, with the help of the government or the state, need to intervene at some point. But that doesn't necessarily require a huge bureaucratic and authoritarian leader and the system. And we will have more of this kind of planning everywhere, and we still haven't have a very good detailed theory with democratic planning yet, because planning has been something very external to the logic of capitalism, especially neoliberalism. Is about market competition and price and profit and so on. But this system of profit making is turning out quite inefficient, because capitalism invests in what is profitable, not necessarily what is important and what is sustainable and so on. So I think we really have to restructure the entire process of decision making, because it is not just simply about profit making. It needs to be about necessity, provisioning, and equity and so on. But these are the things that, as I said in the beginning, degrowth people do not necessarily want to talk about. They often tend to talk about reduction of working hours, basic income, a little bit of carbon taxes, and so on. These are obviously important, but at the same time, I think this new idea of socialist democratic planning will be added on the list. And I think here the socialist tradition can actually contribute a lot, because we have a debate in the 20s, for example, initiated by Otto Neurath, and then these are the kind of things that we can actually maybe explore again in order to imagine a future society.
You state that envisioning another clear, bright future from a Marxian perspective without falling into pessimism and apocalypticism in the face of global ecological crisis is a really important part of your project. So you now just stated some elements of it when it comes to democratic planning. Are there other aspects of this political imaginary that you would like to sketch for us?
I think, I'm not a policymaker, so people can actually add whatever they like on this list of demands. But what I wanted to do as a philosopher is basically this reworking of our narrow horizon of ideas, because even especially like countries like Japan, where the society is very conservative, but also in European and American societies, people do not talk about socialism or communism anymore after the collapse of Soviet Union. People sort of give up achieving something beyond capitalism. They only talk about green capitalism or stakeholder capitalism, and it's like everything about capitalism but with some better adjective. But I do not think this is really compatible, because capitalism is about greed, capitalism is about monopoly, capitalism is about destroying the planet. So I think the green capitalism or these kind of things are not really possible, and in a sense these are very ideological, because they hide the truth that the capitalism is not sustainable. But we will often stick to that kind of ideas because we believe that capitalism is something inevitable and we can never overcome anymore, and so on. But I think I was also inspired by left accelerationist in the sense they also demanded some kind of the utopian ideas, and I think this tradition of the left needs to come back, especially because capitalism is now failing in many aspects. So I think one of my project, Degrowth Communism, is okay. It's totally fine to talk about socialism or communism again, or it isn't even necessary. Otherwise, our political solution, our social movement, and our other concrete measures like policies will be confined always within capitalism. And I'm not saying that the communism or socialism will be very easily achieved. We have to start with something that we could do. Even abandoning or banning private jet is really hard if we think about these power relations today. But even after that successful banning of private jets, it's capitalism. The society will be totally capitalist, but with some very different ideas of what's the final goal of being rich. Today it's having private jets, but they have to rethink because it's banned already. So our conception of wealth and our conception of economic activity or the goal of economic activity will gradually change. And this will create some rooms for more radical anti-capitalist activities. And so this is, in a sense, as Joachim Hirsch once said, radicaler reformism, so radical reformism. And so this is a reformism. We gradually, tax bad things and stop bad production and ban certain things. It's gradual process within capitalism, so it's reformist, but at the same time it will have a very radical conquest after certain point. So this is something that we should do. We cannot aim after the kind of the Soviet Russian Revolution today anymore. It will not be successful. It will not automatically change this entire system so easily. So we should have this kind of the radical reformist politics.
And since you obviously ditch this idea that there is some deterministic historical materialism in which there will be necessarily some form of conflict which will escalate and then lead to communism. The question remains whether or not there will have to be a moment of revolution, because right now you kind of sketched ideas around this idea of revolutionäre Realpolitik, but do you think there will have to be some form of kairos moment or moment of rupture in which some kind of revolutionary moment breaks through? And if yes, what could this look like?
Oh yes. I mean, there will be those moments, and there, because this current status quo will not be continued. We have this kind of polycrisis of ecology, capitalism, democracy, and so on. So I mean, so many things will be going down, and then there will be more and more conflict and expression of dissatisfaction everywhere, and this will accelerate in the coming years. So in a sense that there will be a moment of uprisings, hopefully, and there will be a more radical imaginaries coming out of those movements. These are recent events about, Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, and I always endorse those kind of attempts, and I highly respect those people who are actually acting and fighting against injustice and so on. But this is something, I think, it's something not what we can already predict, and it will be. I will be inspired and I will learn from these new revolutionary moments. But rather what I'm trying to do in my book is what we can do even without those kind of uprising. And maybe we will have to, we cannot wait until these events come. So we have to first implement some of the measures that we can actually start now without those ruptures. But I also understand your point. I mean, even banning, as I said, the private jet is one of the easiest example, but even that will probably require some kind of the disruption and the uprising that could be regarded as something revolutionary. So let's see how it will happen. But I think first point about my book is basically we will have to set a kind of new vision, a new idea, which should be today termed as Degrowth Communism.
Kohei, there's a last question I ask all of my guests, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Well, I'm not that optimistic about the current situation. So in this kind of gloomy times, I sometimes think we are all kind of doomed. But at the same time, especially as a philosopher, I think we need to have a kind of the optimism of the will. We will still have some chance to create a better future. And then there are people who have been fighting for various justice in the past, and then that's why we, especially at least in the countries like Japan, in Austria, people enjoy basic human rights and democracy and a good environment and so on. These are the results of a constant fighting, and it's we also owe to the people in the past. And I think one of the way is that we try to continue, and we are witnessing the emergence of even younger generations acting in a very radical way than the past generations. So I'm very optimistic. In a sense, I'm very optimistic when I see these new movements coming out, and I can also learn from them and fight with them and create maybe a better future.
Wonderful. Kohei, thank you so much for being part of Future Histories.
Thank you.